For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant. A brief-lived species from an unstable world. Emotion-driven. Politically divided. Chronically inefficient. In the vast archives of the Galactic Council, Earth occupied a narrow margin, annotated, categorized, and quietly dismissed. Humanity's early steps into interstellar space were awkward and uneven, marked by internal disputes and fragile coalitions that never seemed to last. Compared to civilizations that had mastered unity before reaching the stars, humans looked unfinished. Ignored by the galaxy. Dismissed by those in power. The Council had long believed it understood danger. Real threats announced themselves loudly, with expansion fleets, rigid ideologies, or demands for recognition. Humanity did none of that. They argued among themselves. Failed publicly. Rebuilt slowly. Progress came in bursts, followed by setbacks that appeared to confirm every pessimistic projection. To the Council, this meant safety. No one realized how dangerous that assumption was. Because humanity did not evolve under stability. They evolved under collapse. Their history was a cycle of systems breaking at the worst possible moments. Governments failing overnight, economies imploding without warning, institutions crumbling when people needed them most. Survival was never guaranteed. It was earned repeatedly, through adaptation rather than authority. Humans learned early that rules could vanish. That leaders could fail. That rescue was never assured. So when humanity finally encountered the wider galaxy, they did not arrive with entitlement or ambition. They watched, listened, studied how power actually functioned beyond speeches and treaties. They noticed something unsettling. The galaxy did not rule through strength. It ruled through intervention. When a species grew inconvenient, the Council stepped in, regulating trade, redefining rights, reshaping outcomes while insisting it was for the greater good. Control was rarely violent. It was procedural. Polite. Absolute. Humanity paid attention. Formal contact was deliberately unremarkable. Protocols were followed precisely. Requests were submitted correctly. No urgency. No defiance. Humanity behaved exactly as a small, manageable civilization was expected to behave. And the Council relaxed. Decades passed. Human space grew quieter. Less visible. Less demanding. To the Council, it appeared humanity had accepted guidance, another minor species stabilized by oversight and limits it would never challenge. They believed intervention had worked. They believed humanity would always respond to correction. They never asked why human systems were becoming harder to predict. Why trade dependencies subtly shifted. Why human communication traffic grew quieter, not weaker, but more focused. They mistook silence for compliance. They never considered that humanity was learning something fundamental while being ignored. Intervention only works on civilizations that still need it. By the time irregularities began to surface, subtle anomalies in trade flows, unexplained resilience in human infrastructure, regions of space where Council influence no longer produced expected results, it was already too late to revisit assumptions. Humanity was no longer reacting. They were choosing. And when the Galactic Council finally tried to intervene again, to correct, to stabilize, to assert authority, they would discover something profoundly unsettling. Humanity did not argue, did not protest, did not comply. They ignored them. And in that moment, the galaxy would begin to understand a truth the Council had never prepared for. The most dangerous mistake is not underestimating a civilization's strength. It is assuming they will always listen when you speak. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not abruptly. Not publicly. Intervention, after all, was supposed to look responsible. Measured. Benevolent. Humanity wasn't being punished, at least not in the language the Council used. They were being corrected. First came the trade restrictions. Human shipping corridors were placed under extended review. Docking permissions stalled indefinitely. Customs inspections multiplied until schedules collapsed under their own weight. Insurance networks quietly reclassified human vessels as elevated risk, turning commerce into an unviable gamble without a single law being openly violated. Trade was cut. Critical imports slowed, then stopped altogether. Medical compounds. Advanced alloys. Precision components. Peripheral colonies felt the strain first, then the core worlds. Prices rose. Stockpiles thinned. Supply chains frayed. Council economists watched the data with practiced confidence. They had seen this before. Scarcity led to unrest. Unrest led to division. Division justified intervention. Then came the legal measures. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost access to council chambers. Observer status was suspended under language so vague it could mean anything, and therefore justify everything. Information networks that once returned open data now delivered filtered fragments or silence. Travel permits expired and were not renewed. Diplomatic channels degraded into automated acknowledgments. Humanity was no longer a participant. They were a case file. Isolation followed. No fleets surrounded Earth. No weapons darkened human skies. The Council did not need force. They simply removed humanity from the systems that sustained interstellar civilization, trade, arbitration, legitimacy, and waited. Humanity was pushed into isolation with the calm certainty of an authority that had done this many times before. The Council expected collapse. They expected humanity's internal divisions to re-emerge under pressure. Expected colonies to hoard resources. Expected governments to fracture and blame one another as scarcity deepened. Expected desperate transmissions asking for reinstatement once reality set in. Projections were filed. Months to instability. 1 year to unrest. 2 years to compliance. But the collapse never came. Instead, something quietly alarming happened. Human systems stabilized. Emergency protocols activated before shortages peaked. Manufacturing priorities shifted without public debate. Rationing was implemented efficiently and calmly. There were no mass riots. No planetary secessions. Human communication traffic surged, but not with outrage. With coordination. Long-standing political rivals shared data without treaties or announcements. Old disputes were paused, not resolved, but rendered irrelevant. The Council flagged the anomaly. Then dismissed it. They mistook restraint for denial. What they failed to understand was that humanity had lived this scenario before, repeatedly. Economic crashes. Political failures. Environmental disasters. Systems breaking when they were needed most. Isolation wasn't shocking. It was familiar. Humanity did not appeal to Council morality. Did not threaten retaliation. Did not beg for intervention. They did something far more destabilizing. They stopped responding. Trade rerouted inward. Local industries expanded into roles once outsourced to the galaxy. Older technologies were revived, redesigned, and scaled beyond what Council regulations had ever permitted. Every rule was followed, perfectly. Every clause obeyed to the letter. Every loophole used without technically violating a single statute. Sanctions meant to isolate human space began rippling outward, quietly damaging Council-aligned economies that had depended on human adaptability more than they cared to admit. The Council waited for fracture. It never came. Instead, human space grew quieter. More ordered. More deliberate. Reports began to note a troubling trend. Humanity was becoming self-sufficient. Less responsive to pressure. Less affected by intervention. Less dependent on a system that only worked when everyone agreed it mattered. Containment had always succeeded because civilizations feared isolation. Humanity did not. They treated it as a condition to engineer around. And somewhere deep in the Council's projections, an uncomfortable realization began to form, one no one was yet willing to say aloud. Intervention only works on those who still care to be intervened upon. Humanity no longer did. And with that, the Council's grip, so carefully applied, so confidently measured, began to slip, not because it was resisted, but because it was being ignored. Isolation was meant to force a correction. That was the Council's logic. When intervention failed, exclusion finished the work. Cut a civilization off from trade, legitimacy, and oversight, and internal fractures would surface. Authority would be restored not through force, but necessity. Humanity should have broken. It didn't. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first, the shift was subtle enough to escape notice. Political rhetoric softened. Ideological battles that had defined entire eras began to lose relevance. Leaders who thrived on division found their audiences shrinking, not because disagreements vanished, but because argument no longer mattered. When the last sanctioned trade lanes went silent, humanity stopped asking who was right. They asked who would survive. Old divisions vanished. Not erased. Not forgiven. Set aside. Borders remained on maps, but they stopped dictating behavior. Rival governments paused conflicts that had lasted generations, without treaties, without declarations, without celebration. Humanity did not glorify unity. They defaulted to it. Because isolation stripped away illusion. There was no higher authority to appeal to. No external stabilizer to rely on. No council fleet arriving to impose order if things went wrong. Humanity was alone. And once that truth settled in, priorities aligned with ruthless clarity. Emergency councils formed across Earth and its colonies, but instead of expanding bureaucracy, they dismantled it. Redundant authorities were merged or discarded. Decision chains were shortened. Not centralized for dominance, but streamlined for speed. What emerged wasn't an empire. It was coordination. For the first time in human history, every major colony operated under a single operational framework. Not built on ideology. Not culture. Not ambition. Survival. All colonies stood under one command. It wasn't a throne or a singular ruler. It was a system, lean, adaptive, intolerant of inefficiency. Authority became situational. Whoever had the clearest data and fastest response acted. Prestige evaporated. Ego became a liability overnight. Logistics became power. Supply chains that once competed synchronized across systems. Manufacturing priorities aligned without negotiation. Research institutions opened archives sealed for generations, sharing breakthroughs once guarded by profit, secrecy, or pride. Humanity stopped optimizing against itself. They optimized for endurance. Military forces changed, not in scale, but in purpose. Fleets once designed to deter rivals were restructured to protect infrastructure, evacuation corridors, and population centers. Training doctrine abandoned decisive victories in favor of prolonged survival under catastrophic conditions. Humanity stopped planning for wars they hoped to win. They planned for disasters they intended to outlast. Civilians were folded into preparedness without ceremony. Engineers trained for emergency repair. Medics drilled for mass casualty scenarios. Colonists learned redundancy protocols as naturally as daily routines. Every person became part of the system, not as a soldier, but as a stabilizing component. Humanity did not militarize its population. It prepared it. Then came the silence. No protests. No defiant broadcasts. No pleas sent into the void. Human communication traffic actually decreased, even as coordination reached levels no external observer had ever recorded. Unity did not make humanity louder. It made them efficient, focused, unsettlingly calm. Council analysts misread the data. Silence had always meant submission before. They believed humanity had accepted isolation. That exclusion had taught them humility. In truth, isolation had taught humanity clarity. They stopped measuring success by recognition or inclusion. They measured it by resilience. By how well systems held under pressure. By how little external approval mattered when survival was on the line. Isolation did what no treaty ever had. It forced humanity to see itself as a single organism. Every colony understood its role. Every fleet knew its purpose. Every citizen knew what was at stake. If no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Not out of anger. Not out of defiance. Out of necessity. And in that moment, quiet, deliberate, irreversible, the Council's attempt to intervene failed completely. They had not corrected humanity. They had unified it. And a unified humanity no longer waited for anyone else to decide how it would survive. In silence, humanity evolved. There were no announcements. No declarations meant to draw attention back to human space. No public demonstrations of strength. Humanity had learned that visibility invited intervention, and intervention invited control. So they worked unseen. Isolation stripped away distraction. Research institutions that once competed for prestige and funding were reorganized into cooperative networks. Projects stalled by politics were revived by necessity. Engineers stopped designing for ideal conditions and began designing for inevitability, assuming systems would fail, supply lines would vanish, and help would never come. New engines came first. Not engines built for speed or expansion, but for endurance. Drives capable of operating for years without resupply. Propulsion systems tolerant of damage, inefficiency, and improvised repair. Human ships sacrificed elegance for reliability, favoring designs that could limp forward instead of dying spectacularly. They could travel farther without support. They could remain operational without permission. They no longer needed approval to move. Then came the shields. Galactic doctrine favored singular, overwhelming barriers, immense constructs that either held perfectly or failed catastrophically. Humanity rejected that approach entirely. They layered everything. Adaptive fields that reshaped under stress. Redundant systems that degraded gradually instead of collapsing all at once. Structural composites that absorbed force rather than attempting to negate it outright. Human shields were not invincible. They were persistent. They bent. They cracked. They kept working. Weapons followed, but quietly. Humanity did not pursue extinction-level firepower or theatrical superweapons. They focused on systems that functioned after prolonged isolation. Weapons that could be repaired in deep space by exhausted crews using limited tools. Human weapons were not impressive. They were dependable. And then there were the fleets. They were not assembled in massive, centralized shipyards that could be observed, catalogued, and neutralized. Production was distributed across dozens of systems. Hull sections fabricated in civilian industries. Components built to common standards, modular, interchangeable, resilient. No single ship mattered. No single loss could cripple the whole. Fleets were built not for conquest, but survival. Naval doctrine evolved alongside them. Ships were designed to operate independently, cut off from command, guided by shared principles rather than constant instruction. Crews were cross-trained relentlessly. Every officer understood logistics. Every technician understood emergency repair. Human fleets assumed chaos as the baseline. Loss of communication. Overwhelming odds. Extended isolation. They trained until those conditions felt routine. The galaxy noticed nothing. Council sensors detected no alarming mobilization. No aggressive maneuvers. No treaty violations. Human space appeared quiet, constrained, irrelevant. Exactly as intended. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Not for retaliation. For inevitability. Human simulations grew darker. Scenarios assumed hostile powers, collapsing alliances, and enemies immune to diplomacy. Victory was redefined. Not defeat the enemy. Ensure continuation. If a colony survived, the mission succeeded. If a fleet endured catastrophic loss and still functioned, the mission succeeded. If humanity remained, everything else was secondary. Command structures flattened. Authority became situational. Any unit could assume control. Any plan could be abandoned instantly if reality demanded it. Humanity stopped fearing failure. They learned to absorb it. The Council, reviewing outdated reports, concluded humanity had stagnated. That intervention had capped their growth. That isolation had enforced stability. They were wrong. Humanity had not slowed. They had finished building. What remained was refinement. Stress testing. Quiet positioning beyond assumption and observation. And when the galaxy finally looked back, when something emerged that intervention could not restrain, it would not find a weakened civilization desperate for attention. It would find a species that had spent years preparing for the moment when being ignored was no longer a disadvantage, but a strategic choice. The first warning did not arrive as an attack. It arrived as silence. A frontier system missed its scheduled status report. No distress signal. No debris. No evidence of malfunction. Council analysts flagged it as a routine relay failure and reassigned the sensors. Border systems failed all the time. Intervention would wait until there was proof. Then a second system went dark. Then a third. By the time unauthorized evacuation routes filled with fleeing ships, the pattern was undeniable. Refugee vessels arrived damaged and overcrowded, carrying fragmented sensor data, corrupted recordings, and a single name spoken with exhausted certainty. The Dominion. They did not announce themselves. They did not negotiate. They arrived. The Dominion was not an alliance or a crusade. It was an empire optimized for expansion, every doctrine refined for speed, efficiency, and permanence. Their fleets moved with mechanical precision, overwhelming defenses before panic could organize into resistance. Worlds fell. Orbital platforms were neutralized in minutes. Planetary shields collapsed under sustained, methodical pressure. Defense fleets were dismantled in sequence, not in heroic last stands, but in clean operations that left no space for improvisation. The Dominion did not seek destruction. They sought ownership. Species were enslaved, not exterminated, classified. Populations were sorted by utility. Administrators were retained under supervision. Labor forces reassigned. Entire cultures reduced to production metrics and compliance thresholds. Resistance was not punished publicly. It was removed. Quietly. Efficiently. Permanently. Fear spread faster than the invasion itself. Council-aligned task forces were deployed, veteran fleets armed with technologies that had enforced intervention for millennia. They engaged the Dominion and vanished. Not in spectacular explosions, but in silence. Signals cut off mid-transmission. Formations dissolved without explanation. The Dominion studied, adapted, advanced. And still, the Council argued. Emergency assemblies convened and collapsed into procedural paralysis. Committees debated response thresholds while live feeds showed cities burning. Jurisdiction disputes delayed action. Voting blocs stalled decisive measures, insisting intervention must be proportional, coordinated, authorized. Some delegates called for negotiation. Others demanded sanctions. A few proposed sacrifice, ceding outer systems to preserve the core. Time was something the Dominion did not allow. As invasion fronts pushed inward, Council authority fractured. Member species recalled fleets to defend their own worlds. Mutual defense treaties were reinterpreted, delayed, or quietly ignored. Trade collapsed as fear overrode obligation. The Council could intervene. In theory. In practice, it could only debate. Within cycles, the unthinkable became undeniable. The Galactic Council, the institution built to manage crises, was losing control of one it could not regulate. That was when the chamber fell silent. Someone spoke the name no one wanted to hear. Humanity. The objections came instantly. Humanity had been isolated, sanctioned, removed from meaningful participation. Their fleets were undocumented. Their technology unverified. Their civilization, by Council projections, should have fractured long ago under intervention and exclusion. But others remembered. Human space had gone quiet years before the Dominion appeared. No collapse. No refugee waves. No desperate appeals for reinstatement. Just absence, orderly, deliberate absence. Reluctantly, the Council authorized contact. The message was carefully constructed. Polite. Urgent without sounding desperate. It spoke of shared survival, collective defense, and the need for coordinated intervention against an existential threat. It did not mention sanctions. It did not include apologies. Humanity received it. They did not respond immediately. While Council worlds burned, humanity analyzed. Dominion fleet movements. Tactical doctrine. Logistics throughput. Behavioral patterns. They compared the invasion against internal simulations, some of which mirrored the unfolding disaster with unsettling accuracy. The Council expected panic. They received silence. Hours passed. Then days. Another system fell, close enough to the Council core that evacuation alerts echoed through the chamber itself. Delegates who had argued procedural nuance moments earlier now pleaded openly for assistance. When humanity finally replied, the response was calm, measured, almost unsettling in its restraint. They acknowledged the Dominion threat. They confirmed the Council's defensive models would fail. They stated, plainly that humanity possessed the capability to engage. There was no promise of rescue, only assessment. The Council protested, invoked shared destiny, demanded urgency, insisted intervention required coordination, authorization, oversight. Humanity did not hurry, because the truth was now unavoidable. The Council had built a system where intervention was control, and control required consent. The Dominion ignored consent entirely. It did not fear oversight. It did not respond to sanctions. It did not pause for debate. And the only civilization that had prepared for a universe where intervention failed was the one that had learned to live without it. As another Council world burned in real time, the oldest authority in the galaxy faced a reality it had never planned for. Intervention did not stop the Dominion. Procedure did not slow it. Balance did not restrain it. Only preparation could. With no leverage left and no illusions remaining, the Galactic Council did something it had never truly done before. It stopped trying to intervene, and instead it asked, not as an authority, not as a stabilizer, but as an institution watching its own limits collapse. They turned to humanity. Because when intervention failed, when oversight meant nothing and systems burned while debates continued, humanity was the only civilization that had prepared for what came next. And in that moment, the Council finally understood the cost of being ignored. Humanity had not rejected intervention out of defiance. They had outgrown it. And now, as the galaxy burned and the Dominion advanced, the Council faced a truth more frightening than any enemy fleet. The only ones left who could act were the ones who had learned how to act without permission. The Council expected forgiveness. They prepared for it the way they always had, carefully phrased statements, responsibility softened into misjudgment, urgency framed as shared survival. In every crisis before this one, fear had produced compliance. Authority bent just enough to endure. They believed humanity would respond the same way. Humanity did not. The reply arrived without ceremony. No accusations. No references to intervention or isolation. Just confirmation of receipt, and a clinical assessment of the threat the Council had failed to contain. The analysis was unsettling in its precision. Invasion vectors underestimated. Response times overestimated. Defensive assumptions invalid. Humanity did not argue the Council's decisions. They explained their consequences. Then came the decision. Not a speech. Not a declaration. A single sentence. We will decide when to act. No conditions followed. No request for authority. No demand for apology. Just resolve. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted about moral obligation and collective extinction. Some accused humanity of cruelty. Others of arrogance. A few attempted to reassert control, invoking charters, emergency powers, and oversight protocols that now sounded like relics. Humanity did not respond. They didn't need to, because authority ceases to exist the moment it is ignored. Within hours, deep space observatories began reporting anomalies near the edges of human-controlled space. Not weapons fire. Not fleet mobilization. Something quieter. Gravitational sensors detected rhythmic distortions, too precise to be natural. Navigation beacons recalibrated themselves without instruction. Light bent at subtle, impossible angles, as if space itself were being adjusted rather than disturbed. Council engineers blamed calibration drift. They were wrong. Independent traders reported vast silhouettes appearing briefly beyond sensor resolution, too large to classify, too controlled to dismiss. Not fleets forming up, but structures aligning. Patterns emerging across regions too vast to be coincidence. Humanity was not rushing to war. They were positioning. A final transmission arrived, short, unencrypted, unmistakably human. Any engagement with the Dominion would occur on human terms. Timing, location, and scope would be determined by human command. Council authorization was unnecessary. Oversight would not be accepted. This was not a threat. It was a boundary. For the first time since its founding, the Galactic Council confronted a truth it could not intervene against. Humanity did not need its permission, did not fear its displeasure, did not confuse urgency with obligation. As the chamber dissolved into chaos, something unexpected happened on the invasion front. The Dominion slowed. Not halted. Not repelled. Just slowed, enough for their commanders to sense inconsistencies in predictive models that had never failed before. Enough to feel resistance before it appeared. Somewhere beyond the reach of Council authority, something vast finished aligning. Space itself began to tremble. Humanity had not yet acted. But the galaxy already understood what the Council had only just realized. Forgiveness is offered by those seeking approval. Permission is asked by those who still believe in intervention. Humanity was neither. And when they finally chose to act, it would not be because the Council had intervened, but because humanity had decided the moment had arrived. The Dominion never realized when the war began. There was no surge in subspace. No spike in energy signatures. No warning cascade screaming across their sensors. One moment, Dominion armadas advanced through occupied systems with mechanical certainty, formations perfected through centuries of uncontested conquest. The next moment, space was no longer empty. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. They did not arrive from anywhere. There was no translation flare, no rupture, no distortion of space-time announcing their presence. They simply resolved into existence, vast, deliberate shapes unfolding from the dark as if reality itself had made room for them. Massive, precise, unstoppable. The formations defied every known doctrine. They were not clustered for attack or spread for intimidation. They occupied exact positions across light minutes of space, sealing approach corridors and escape vectors the Dominion had not yet identified as critical. This was not a battle line. It was containment. Dominion sensors struggled to reconcile the data. Targeting solutions lagged behind reality. Command algorithms recalculated endlessly, unable to explain how an opposing force of that scale had appeared without triggering a single early warning threshold. Before any firing order could be issued, every channel ignited at once. Primary command bands. Encrypted tactical relays. Emergency fallback frequencies. Even internal coordination networks believed to be unreachable. One message crossed every channel simultaneously. Stand down. It was not amplified. It carried no threat. It carried certainty. The Dominion fired. They always did. The opening volley never reached its targets. Human defenses did not intercept the energy, they absorbed it. Layered fields reshaped in real time, dispersing force across systems designed to endure punishment rather than negate it. Power that should have overwhelmed any known shield simply vanished into controlled dissipation. The Dominion adapted instantly. They never fired again. Across the invasion fleet, weapon systems desynchronized by fractions of a second, imperceptible individually, catastrophic together. Power grids slipped out of phase. Reactors throttled to emergency limits. Shields collapsed inward, not destroyed, but rendered inert. Drives failed. Thousands of ships went dead in space. Alive. Intact. Helpless. Humanity had not attacked the fleet. They had removed its ability to fight. Dominion command structures unraveled in moments. Emergency protocols refused to execute. Self-destruct systems failed silently. Engineers flooded dead channels, unable to understand why redundancies that had never failed before had turned against them. Human systems were not overpowering Dominion technology. They were exploiting its assumptions. Dependencies so fundamental the Dominion had never thought to protect them. Systems flawless against weaker civilizations and catastrophically fragile against an opponent that had built everything around resilience instead of dominance. Then one human vessel moved. It advanced alone, gliding forward with deliberate calm. Its hull bore no insignia. No declaration of authority. Just a presence so controlled it felt inevitable. It transmitted once more. This conflict is concluded. There were no demands. No negotiations. The statement was final. As the signal propagated, Dominion fleets in neighboring systems halted mid-advance. Slave transports powered down. Occupation forces abandoned positions without orders, uncertain whether movement itself would trigger the same silent neutralization. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Only then did humanity acknowledge the galaxy. A single open transmission, brief, factual, devoid of triumph. The threat had been neutralized. Hostilities were concluded. No territory had changed hands. Humanity had not come to conquer. They had come to end the war. Council observers watched in stunned silence as Dominion armadas drifted powerless in the dark, entire fleets undone without spectacle, without devastation, without permission. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The Council had tried to intervene. Humanity had ignored them. And the war did not end because authority demanded it. It ended because humanity decided it was over. The Council tried to reclaim control. Emergency assemblies were called in rapid succession. Ancient charters were retrieved and recited as if tradition itself could reassert relevance. Committees were formed to define jurisdiction, oversight, and acceptable limits to what humanity had done. The galaxy listened. Then it moved on. It was too late. Because control does not return once it has been revealed to be optional. Worlds rebuilt without waiting for Council authorization. Defense agreements formed laterally, between neighbors who had watched intervention fail while systems burned. Trade resumed along routes humanity had stabilized, not the corridors the Council once regulated. The Council still existed. But it no longer decided what happened next. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They refused every offer of permanent leadership, declined expanded authority, ignored proposals to restructure galactic governance around them. They claimed no territory, imposed no laws, demanded no tribute. They simply stepped back. Not into isolation, but into readiness. Human fleets dispersed into the dark in patterns no strategist could fully map. They did not loom over capitals or patrol borders. They positioned themselves near fracture points, regions where history showed intervention failed first and consequences spread fastest. Always distant, always present, never demanding obedience. Slowly, the galaxy understood what humanity had become. Not conquerors, not rulers, a contingency. When disputes flared, humanity did not intervene. When empires tested one another's resolve, humanity remained silent. They issued no threats. They promised no protection. Their presence alone changed behavior. Former Dominion commanders, those few left alive and unbound, spoke quietly among themselves. Not of human weapons, but of human restraint. Of fleets that could have erased them and chose instead to end the war cleanly, decisively, and without spectacle. That restraint carried more weight than fear ever could. The Council issued one final declaration, warning that a galaxy without centralized intervention would descend into chaos. Few listened. Fewer believed it. Because the galaxy had learned something the Council never had. Stability enforced by control eventually fails. Stability enforced by readiness endures. Humanity had proven that leadership was not inherited through charters or oversight. It emerged from preparation, from competence, from the willingness to act when action was required, and the discipline to stop when it was not. So the galaxy adapted. It always does. And somewhere beyond the chambers where authority once lived, humanity watched the stars in silence. Not from thrones. Not from councils. From the dark. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They had no desire to. They had simply proven a truth no civilization could afford to forget. If darkness rises again, if something worse comes out of the void, if the galaxy hesitates when it matters most, humanity will be there. Not to command, not to conquer, but to make sure there is still a galaxy left when the darkness falls.